There's a certain weight that comes with pretending everything in your life is perfect. I've carried that weight for 3 years now. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and from the outside, my life looks like a suburban dream. Beautiful house in an upscale Boston neighborhood. Successful husband who provides everything we could want. 2 teenage stepsons who seem well-adjusted. But appearances can be deceiving. I remember the day I first met James at a charity gala. He was charming, successful, and seemed to really see me, not just as another face in the crowd, but as someone worth knowing. When he told me about his sons, Ethan and Lucas, he spoke with such pride. I thought I was ready for an instant family. I wasn't. The first year was the hardest. James worked constantly at his law firm, leaving before dawn and returning well after dinner. Building our future, he'd say with a tired smile. But I was living in our present, trying to connect with 2 boys who saw me as an intruder. Ethan, the older one, was always polite but distant. He'd answer my questions with one-word responses, his dark eyes watching me carefully. Lucas was different, sharp, sarcastic, always ready with a cutting remark. But at least he engaged with me, even if it was through conflict. I tried everything to bridge the gap. Family game nights that ended in awkward silence. Cooking lessons that no one showed up for. Shopping trips where I felt more like a chauffeur than a stepmother. James said to give it time, that they'd warm up to me eventually. But time just seemed to make the distance grow wider. Then came the day I noticed something was off. I was doing laundry, a mundane task that shouldn't have changed everything. But it did. Several pieces of my lingerie were missing. At first, I thought nothing of it. Just lost in the wash, maybe mixed up with other clothes. But after searching every laundry basket, every drawer, I knew something wasn't right. The realization hit me one afternoon, when I saw Ethan hurrying out of the laundry room. His face flushed red when he saw me. He mumbled something about needing clean socks and practically ran upstairs. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I really did. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. That night, while Ethan was at basketball practice, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went into his room. The guilt ate at me as I opened his closet door. Hidden beneath a pile of old sweatshirts, I found them. My missing lingerie, carefully folded. My hands trembled as I held the evidence. I should have left right then. Should have waited for James to come home. Should have handled this the right way. Instead, I stayed. I stayed long enough to hear Ethan's footsteps on the stairs. Long enough to see his face when he found me standing there. The look in his eyes, shame, fear, and something else I couldn't name, made my heart race. We stood in silence for what felt like F.O. "Hey Vir, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he finally whispered. His voice cracked slightly. I needed something that felt real. Those words hit me harder than they should have. He looked so lost, so vulnerable. I should have been angry. Should have been disgusted. Instead, I felt something else entirely. "Do you need help?" I heard myself ask. The words came out before I could stop them. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. I quickly clarified, offering to buy him something appropriate. Something that wouldn't cross this line we were standing on. He nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. That should have been the end of it. A week later, I went to a store I never thought I'd enter. Bought something I never thought I'd buy for my stepson. It was awkward, but Ethan seemed grateful. Things went back to normal. Or so I thought. The text came late one night. James was away at a conference, and I was alone in our too-big house. When I saw Ethan's name on my phone, I assumed it was something innocent. A question about dinner. Or maybe asking when his father would be home. It wasn't. It was a video. My fingers shook as I opened it. I knew immediately what I was looking at. Ethan, using what I'd bought him. I should have deleted it instantly. Should have blocked his number. Should have told James everything. Instead, I watched it. Once. Twice. More times than I care to admit. The next morning, Ethan claimed it was a mistake, said he meant to send it to someone else. But the way he looked at me told a different story. It wasn't a mistake, and neither was the way my stomach flipped every time I thought about it. I told myself it was harmless, just flattering attention from someone who actually saw me. After months of feeling invisible in my own home, it felt good to be wanted, but deep down I knew better. I tried to avoid being alone with Ethan after that. I'd clean the kitchen before he got home from practice, retreat to my room early, stay busy with meaningless tasks. It worked for a while, until it didn't. Did I do something wrong? He asked one evening. He was leaning against the kitchen counter while I prepared dinner. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to crack. My hands fumbled with the knife. No, I forced a smile. Why would you think that? He shrugged but didn't look convinced. Later that night, another message. I didn't mean to make things weird, he wrote. I just wanted to show you I was grateful. That's all. I stared at my phone, trying to find the right response. Something neutral. Something safe. It's fine, I finally replied. I'm glad it's helping. But it wasn't fine. And we both knew it. The next few days, everything shifted. Ethan wasn't just polite anymore. He was attentive. He'd linger in the kitchen while I cooked. Offered to help even when I said I didn't need it. Compliment my hair, my clothes, even my laugh. It wasn't obvious enough to raise suspicion, but it was enough to make my skin flush. The worst part, I liked it. For the first time in months, someone was looking at me like I mattered, like I was wanted, and that terrified me. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that he'd lose interest eventually, that I could handle it until then. But one night, as I folded another load of laundry, my phone buzzed again. Another video. My hands trembled as I tapped the screen. I shouldn't have watched it, but I did. And this time, I didn't stop after the first play. I tried to convince myself he'd sent it to the wrong person again, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But when I looked at him the next morning, the look in his eyes told me everything. This wasn't an accident. Ethan was pushing boundaries, and I wasn't stopping him. Did you see what I sent? He asked later that day. I pretended to be busy with the towels, avoided eye contact. You didn't mean to send it to me, I said quickly, trying to shut down the conversation. But he wouldn't let it go. What if I did? My heart skipped. Ethan, this isn't funny. I'm not joking, he stepped closer. I felt my pulse quicken. I don't want things to be weird between us, he said softly. I feel like we understand each other more than anyone else in this house. His words hit me harder than they should have, because deep down I knew he was right. I wanted to be angry, wanted to tell him to stop, to set clear boundaries and walk away. But instead, I let the moment linger. And that's when I realized I wasn't as in control of this situation as I thought. I should have trusted my instincts when James announced he and Lucas had to leave early for the family reunion, leaving Ethan and me to drive down later. I felt it then, that uneasy pull in my stomach. Told myself I was being dramatic. It was just a drive. 5 hours, maybe 6. Then we'd meet up with the rest of the family. But the tension was there, sitting between us like a physical presence I couldn't shake. Ethan offered to take the wheel after the first 2 hours. I let him. I needed the break. Or at least that's what I told myself. Watching him focus on the road, hands steady on the wheel, I couldn't stop noticing how different he looked lately. Older, more confident. I hated myself for noticing. When the rain started, I tried to think of anything but him. The wipers dragged across the windshield, the car crawling forward in traffic. I kept glancing at the clock, calculating how late we'd be. I didn't want to stop for the night, but I knew I couldn't keep driving. We pulled into a small motel off the highway. It wasn't much, just a place to sleep. But when the receptionist said they only had one room left, my stomach turned. I almost said no. Almost told her we'd keep driving through the rain. But I didn't. I told myself it was fine. It was just one night. And yet, when we stepped into that room and saw the single bed, I knew I'd made a mistake. I kept myself busy, unpacking a bag I didn't need to unpack, brushing my hair longer than necessary, changed into the plainest pajamas I could find, hoping it would dull whatever tension had been simmering all day. It didn't. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone like he hadn't noticed how close we were. But I noticed. I felt his presence every second. Then he spoke. His words weren't complicated, just an observation about how much I did for everyone, how no one ever asked how I was doing. I tried to laugh it off, tried to act like it didn't hit me right where it hurt. But when I turned around and saw the way he was looking at me, like I was someone worth noticing, I froze. I should have shut it down, should have said goodnight, and turned off the lights. Instead, I sat down beside him. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. But suddenly the space between us wasn't there anymore. It didn't feel wrong. Not at first. It felt like being wanted. Like being seen. I told myself it was a mistake as soon as it was over. Told myself it wouldn't happen again. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I already knew I was lying. The drive the next morning was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Ethan sat beside me, quiet but calm. Too calm. I hated him for it. Even as part of me envied how easy it seemed for him to move past what had happened. I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The way it felt. The way I didn't hesitate. James greeted us with a hug when we finally arrived. Like nothing had changed. Lucas barely looked up from his phone. It should have been a relief. But it wasn't. I felt exposed. Like the truth was written all over my face. I avoided Ethan as much as I could. But it didn't matter. Every time our eyes met, I felt that pull again. And worse, I could tell he felt it too. I told myself it was over. Told myself I'd pretend it never happened and move on. But Ethan didn't let me. He didn't push. Didn't corner me. Instead, he lingered. He stayed close, offering to help with dishes, finding excuses to brush past me in the kitchen. And every time, my resolve cracked a little more. The worst part was how easy it became to justify. James barely noticed me anymore. He was too busy, too tired, too distracted. And Ethan noticed everything. But I wasn't the only one who noticed. It started small. Lucas making comments about how close Ethan and I seemed lately, asking why he was always around me, why we kept disappearing to clean up after dinner or rearrange the garage. I brushed him off, laughed at his jokes, told myself he was just being nosy, but the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. And then one night, everything changed. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen. Ethan had left an hour earlier, but Lucas stayed behind, scrolling through his phone at the counter. I was halfway to my room when he called after me. "I saw you." I stopped, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear him over it. I told myself he couldn't know. He couldn't have seen anything. But when I turned around, Lucas's face was steady. Too steady. He didn't say it outright. He didn't have to. All he said was that he wasn't planning to tell James. Not yet. I felt relief for a split second. Then came the fear. He didn't have to tell James to destroy me. One wrong word. One look. And everything I tried to protect would come crashing down. I wanted to believe he'd keep my secret. I wanted to believe he wouldn't go there. But the way he smiled before walking out of the kitchen told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over. Not even close. For weeks, I convinced myself that no one noticed the tension between me and Ethan. I told myself we were careful. Too careful for anyone to suspect a thing. But Lucas was smarter than I gave him credit for. He'd always been observant, picking up on details most people missed. At first, I brushed off his questions and teasing remarks as harmless. But then it changed. I was in the laundry room folding clothes when my phone buzzed. A message from Lucas. My stomach sank before I even opened it. It wasn't words. It was a video. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears as I tapped the screen. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. Ethan and me, caught in a moment I tried so hard to forget. I couldn't breathe. Lucas must have been outside the room that night, listening, recording, and now he had proof. I wanted to scream, to cry, to storm into his room and beg him to delete it. But before I could even think straight, another message appeared. We need to talk. I found him in his room, sitting casually on his bed like nothing was wrong. I didn't even get the chance to speak before he held up his phone. Relax, he said. I'm not sending this to Dad. Not if you do what I ask. His words hit me like ice water. Ask, I choked out. He didn't blink. You're going to make this worth my while or this, he tapped his phone. Go straight to him. My entire world tilted. I tried reasoning with him, tried begging him to delete it, but he just smirked. Lucas wasn't playing games. He knew he had me, and he wasn't afraid to use it. The demands started small. Late-night errands. Cash for things he wouldn't explain. But they grew fast. I told myself I was protecting my family, protecting James. If he found out what I'd done, it would destroy him. It would destroy all of us. But the more Lucas asked, the less I recognized myself. I wasn't Sarah anymore. I was his puppet, doing whatever it took to keep my secret buried. And the worst part, Ethan had no idea. The guilt was unbearable. Every time Lucas looked at me, it felt like he was tightening a noose. I couldn't escape, but Ethan made it worse. He wasn't the same boy I'd tried to comfort all those weeks ago. He was different now, more confident, more possessive. He didn't ask for my attention anymore. He expected it, and I gave it. I hated myself every time I did, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop when he brushed past me in the kitchen, his hand lingering just a second too long. I couldn't stop when he waited up for me after James had gone to bed, leaning against the counter with that same look he'd given me in the motel room. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just an illusion, something I'd created out of desperation. But the way Ethan looked at me made it feel real. And Lucas saw it all. One night, after James had fallen asleep, Lucas cornered me in the hallway again. You think no one notices, he said. But I do. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're not as careful as you think. I wanted to slap him, to scream at him, but all I could do was stand there, frozen. You know what I want, he said before walking away. I felt sick. The demands grew darker. Lucas wanted more, not just errands or cash. He wanted my time, my attention. And as his demands escalated, so did Ethan's jealousy. He started asking questions about why Lucas suddenly needed so much from me, about why I always looked so tense. I lied again and again. I lied, but Ethan didn't believe me. He started pushing harder, showing up in places he knew Lucas might be, keeping an eye on me like he could sense something was wrong. It didn't help that James had started noticing too. He'd been distracted for so long that I thought he'd never see it. But lately he'd been asking questions about why I seemed tired, why I'd been so distracted, why Lucas had suddenly stopped arguing with me. He even asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, but I wasn't fine. I was unraveling. I couldn't keep up the lie. I couldn't keep pretending. Every time Lucas sent another text, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might stop. Every time Ethan got too close, I felt like I was drowning. I wanted out, but there was no way out. If I told James the truth, I'd lose him. I'd lose everything. If I gave Lucas what he wanted, I'd lose myself. And Ethan wasn't letting go. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that kept repeating itself. And no matter how many times I woke up, I couldn't escape. I thought I could handle Lucas. I thought if I gave him what he wanted, just enough to keep him quiet, he'd eventually lose interest and let me breathe again. But blackmail doesn't work that way. The more I gave, the more he took. He started texting me late at night, asking me to come to his room, just to talk at first. I thought maybe he wanted to confront me about what I'd done. Maybe he'd have a moment of clarity and decide to let it go. But that wasn't it. Lucas wasn't letting anything go. If anything, he was enjoying it. The power, the control. And I let him. But it wasn't enough for him to own my secret. He wanted to push me further, to see how far he could go before I snapped. And I snapped. It started with another text. This time a video clip I hadn't even opened. Before my hands started shaking, I stormed into his room without knocking, slamming the door behind me. I told him it had to stop. I told him I couldn't take it anymore. But he just laughed. "You're not going anywhere," he said, "unless you want Dad to see this." I don't remember what I said after that. All I know is that my voice was loud enough to draw Ethan's attention. He burst through the door, and the look on his face, the anger, the betrayal, was worse than anything I could have imagined. I didn't even have time to explain before Ethan lunged at Lucas. The room erupted. Ethan was shouting. Lucas was laughing, egging him on. And I just stood there, frozen. By the time I pulled Ethan back, Lucas was smirking like he'd won. "You really thought you could keep this a secret forever?" he said. I don't know what came over me, but suddenly everything spilled out. I told them everything. How it started, why it happened, how I'd let it go too far. I couldn't stop myself. The words kept coming. Like once I started, I couldn't put them back in. When it was over, Ethan looked at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. And Lucas, he just stood there, holding his phone like it was a loaded weapon. I'd hoped telling the truth would make me feel lighter, but it didn't. It just made everything heavier. I tried to act normal. I tried to cook dinner, clean the house, go through the motions like nothing had changed. But James wasn't stupid. I could feel his eyes on me at the table, watching the way I flinched whenever Lucas spoke, or how I couldn't meet Ethan's gaze. "What's going on with you?" he asked later that night. I froze. I told him I was tired. That work had worn me out. And he let it go. For the moment. But I knew it wouldn't last. The next morning he asked again. I snapped at him. I couldn't help it. The pressure was unbearable. And I took it out on him. And that's when I saw it. The doubt in his eyes. James had always trusted me. But not anymore. He didn't say anything right away. But I knew he was watching. He noticed how Lucas lingered around me. How Ethan barely spoke at dinner anymore. The walls were closing in. And I had no way out. Lucas still had the video. Ethan was hurt and angry. And James was starting to put the pieces together. I wanted to confess. I wanted to rip the Band-Aid off and tell James everything. Let the truth destroy me so I could finally breathe again. But every time I opened my mouth, fear swallowed the words. I couldn't lose him. I couldn't lose this life I'd built, even if it was built on lies. So I kept pretending, but pretending was exhausting. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, every time Lucas walked into the room, every time James asked another question. And through it all, Ethan just stared at me, silent, angry, disappointed. I thought losing James would be the worst part, but losing Ethan felt worse. I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it all from falling apart. Then came the night that changed everything. James was working late again. Lucas was at a friend's house. And Ethan was waiting for me in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said. The same words Lucas had used, but different somehow, heavier. "About what happened," he continued. "About everything." I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. I told Dad. 3 words. That's all it took to shatter my world. "What?" I whispered. "I told him everything," Ethan said. His voice was steady. Too steady. About us. About Lucas. All of it. The room started spinning. When? This morning. Before he left for work. That explained the missed calls. The text messages I'd been too afraid to read. He's coming home early, Ethan added. He wants to talk to all of us. I sank into a chair. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading. The truth was finally coming out. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I'm sorry, Ethan said. But he didn't sound sorry. He sounded relieved. Like he'd finally put down a weight he'd been carrying. While I was just beginning to feel the full weight of mine, I heard the front door open. James's footsteps in the hallway. Lucas's voice, confused about why he'd been called home. This was the end. Of my marriage. Of my family. Of everything I'd tried so hard to protect. And as I sat there, waiting for my world to collapse, I realized something. Maybe this was what I'd wanted all along. Not the affair. Not the blackmail. But the truth. The chance to finally stop pretending. To face what I'd done. And accept the consequences. I heard James call my name. His voice steady but strained. It was time. I stood up. Took one last look at Ethan. At the boy who'd started all this. At the man he'd become. And walked toward my fate. Toward the truth. Toward whatever came next. Because sometimes, the only way to fix what's broken is to let it break completely and hope that what rises from the ashes is stronger than what came before. End.